welcome. And this week we start a new Sedra, as we do every time. Let me find the place. I'm going to have to quickly make sure I have our text in front of us. A moment, and I will start this. There we are. And I'm going to, there we are. Okay.
Not for long.
Here we are. Okay, so if you have to mute, be sure to mute. Okay.
Oh.
Right. So we had been talking last year, because this is not the first year we're doing BeHa'alot'cha. This section that we're reading right now has to do with the installation of the Levites formally into their duties as ministers to the priests. And this is what they're presented formally to God to serve Aaron and his sons. We're going to actually read about that. And we read about the specifics of the ceremony, and we are actually moving on to this now. So, v'acharei chen, and after this, ba'u haleviim la'avod et avodatam ba'ohel moed, and after this, the Levites, in other words, after these prescribed ceremonies, the Levites came to serve or to perform their work, ba'ohel moed, in the tent of meeting, lifnei Aharon, before Aaron, v'lifnei vanav, and before his sons, ka'asher tziva Hashem et Moshe, just as Hashem had commanded Moses, al haleviim, regarding the Leviim, kain asu lahim, that is what was done for them. And I assume it also means that they performed it. It all was done. So let's make sure we've got the Rashi here. Here it is. Kasher tziva Hashem v'gomer kain asu. Lahagid shevach ha'osin v'ha'ne'esa bahem. So this is to give praise, to compliment, to praise the ones who performed the ceremony, v'ha'ne'esa bahem, and also the ones who were, to whom this was done. She'achad mehen lo ikev, that not one of them got in the way, not one of them stopped everything happening as it had to happen. So the idea, as you can see here, of obedience, the willingness to submit and to be obedient to God's laws, is something that is mentioned, of course, not just once, but to say that it actually, one gains merit for it, because I think very normally one just rebels against it, that there's something within human nature that just doesn't want to be told what to do, that questions, and that tries to think of other reasons. But the idea of submission is a great spiritual moment. So that's what was happening here. We've mentioned this before, by the way. We've talked about this. That is to say, is it better to do something good because you came up with that idea yourself, or is it better to do something good because you were told to do something good? And the answer within Jewish tradition is that the latter is the greater act, because not only are you doing something good, but you are willing to submit to do that. And the act of submission, again, gets added to the actual act yourself. I know that generally speaking, people tend to think of, well, if it's your own idea, what a great thing. And I'm not necessarily trying to knock that, but the second one takes the ego out of that. So, something to think about. Onwards. Vaydaber Hashem el Moshe lemor. So now we are on to a new idea, but it's still going to have to do with the Leviim. Zot asher la-Leviim, this in regards to the Levites, miben chamesh ve'esrim shana v'mala, from 5 and 20 years and upwards. This is, by the way, something Harlan referred to before. Yavo litzvo tzava, they should come to perform service, ba'avodat ohel moed, regarding the work and the service in the tent of meeting. So somewhat vague, this statement, and Rashi helps us understand by being more specific. So, Zot Asher LaLeviim. Okay, with regards to this particular issue concerning the Levites. Shanim poslim bahem. That is to say that when it comes to Levites, their age is what renders them no longer fit to perform service. Ve'ein hamumim poslim bahem, as opposed to the Kohanim, because in this case with the Levites, physical defects do not render them unfit to serve. And we already learned, we actually studied this together, that with priests, if they do have physical defects, that may prevent them from being able to actually minister at the altar. They actually get the perks, but they're not asked to perform service at the altar. But when it comes to Levites, we're being told physical defects are not an issue. Now, bimin chamesh ve'esrim, from 5 and 20 years old. Uv'makom acher, and Rashi points out that in another place, Omer, it says, and this is in Numbers chapter 4, mi ben shloshim shana, it says from 30 years. Ha ketzad, how do you figure this out? If one place it says 25 and another place says 30, what's it telling us? It seems like a manifest contradiction. Well, in the Tractate Chulin on page 27, it explains, mi ben kafhe ba lilmod hilchot avodah. So when he's 25, he comes to study and learn the laws of that service. Velomed chamesh shanim, and he studies for 5 years. It takes 5 years of study. The course in Levitical practice takes 5 years. Okay. Uven shloshim oved, and when he turns 30, that's when he actually starts to perform the service. So there's a 5-year apprenticeship with regard to learning the job of a Levite. Mikan, and from this we can infer, letalmid shelo ra'a siman yafeh b'mishnato, that if a student doesn't ever see, and literally it means a good sign in his study, b'chamesh shanim, in the course of 5 years, and I'm thinking that what this is talking about is an aha moment. In other words, if you don't, in the course of 5 years of studying, all right, you don't get at least one aha moment where something now, I'm thinking that's what he means. Siman Yafeh is not necessarily so clear. It literally means a good sign, a good omen, something like that. But when it says b'mishnato, so when he's studying or in his studies, so I'm thinking of a good sign in your studies, in the studies themselves. So, sheshuv eino ro'eh. If you're not going to see it within 5 years, you're not going to see it again. And I wonder to myself, I mean, it seems pretty harsh, but I have a feeling that it's really reflective of one's attitude in the study. In other words, are you coming to it with an appetite? Are you coming with a deep desire to learn what it has to tell you or not? And if you're not, the probabilities of your finding something that's akin to an aha moment is probably reduced considerably. So there's something in the fact that in coming even to deal with rational subjects, it nevertheless requires an emotional basis. Okay, let's go here. All right.
Rabbi,
Yes.
I'm trying to go back and forth between chapter 4 and this, and the wording is a little different.
Okay.
The one says, well, this one where we're at says participate.
Yes.
And I don't know if the Ivrit I'm trying to figure out if the Ivrit is different, but I'm not really that good. And the other says are subject to service. So, or yes.
I'd have to actually look at
it's like participate in the workforce. I mean, they could be building, they still have to
Right.
They still have to carry and lug stuff.
That is
So I
correct.
don't know,
That is correct.
so.
Yeah, that's true. But again, the 5 years that they are not actually doing that.
Right.
Acting as apprentices is what they're doing. So, yeah.
So that I mean, that makes sense. I mean,
It does, right. The different
it does. Sure.
supports the conjecture.
Right.
It's good. Umi ben chamishim shana, and from 50 years, Yashuv mitzvah ha'avodah. At that point, he leaves the workforce. Velo ya'avod od, and he does not perform this labor anymore. Now, it doesn't mean complete retirement, as you will see, but it does mean that the actual physical labor, he no longer participates, and we will see what it says. So, velo ya'avod od. So Rashi is going to explain to us our understanding of this phrase that says, he shall no longer serve, he shall no longer do service. He says, avodat masa bakatef. He says, this has to do with carrying on your shoulders. Aval chozerhu l'ni'ilat sharim. But he returns, he continues to serve in the workforce regarding the locking of the gates. So this would, of course, be in the temple now, not so much the Mishkan, but because the Mishkan is a precursor of the temple. Velashir, and to sing. Remember, we talked about Levitical choirs. Veliton agalot, and interestingly, it says here, and to load the carts. Vezehu, okay, and that is what is meant when it says Vesheret et achiv. He shall serve with his brothers. Im achuhi, so this is the Aramaic, in other words, with his brothers, ketargumor, as the Aramaic translates it. So again, without Rashi, we would not necessarily understand this in the sense that it's being shared with us. Okay. Let's see. We're on to verse.
It's also absolutely opposite of what happened in Egypt.
Okay.
That you were allowed to retire, that you would not do physical labor. And in Egypt, you were doing physical labor until you no longer could move.
Right.
So
yeah,
very, very different. I mean, so it is definitely different, and
Mm-hmm.
showing that, yes, you can stop working. It's okay.
Yes. Well, and that's unspecific. It doesn't mean entirely. Okay. It just means
but
stuff that
not the hard stuff, though.
Well, the part that requires physical strength. There's a sense that from between 25 and 50, you're at the maximum strength, physical strength of your life, and from 50 on, it starts to wane. So you're right. I mean, it is interesting in a way that here's the Torah speaking about the idea of a certain form of retirement. Here it is, Vesheret et echav. So the et can be a direct object, but it sometimes also means with. And that's how Rashi has told us. That's what Rashi informed us just now. Vesheret et echav ba'ohel moed. He should serve with his brothers in the tent of meeting, lishmor mishmeret, to stand guard. The Shmor Mishmeret is one way to understand that. In other words, so that would involve locking the gates. In this case, it does includes singing in the choirs, but certainly also preventing any unauthorized person from entering that area, because we know that was forbidden. For avodah lo ya'avod, but he shall not do any physical, or at least that heavy physical work. This is what you shall do for the Levites regarding their duties. So now a whole new subject, but let's finish off the Rashi. Lishmor mishmeret, right? So to perform their duties. Here goes. Lachanot saviv laohel, So the idea was this mishmeret means a watch, right? To encamp around the tent, ula hakim, and to set it up, ula horid, and to dismantle b'sha'at hamasaot, at the time of the journeys. And now we come to a very interesting section, which is akin to Torah Shebaal Peh. What we're going to read eventually, not immediately, is how there is an example of Torah Shebaal Peh, oral Torah, within the written Torah. And as I've mentioned, written Torah is doing what doesn't come naturally to try and help us overcome our emotions and our impulses. But the purpose of oral Torah is circumstances alter cases. In other words, depending on the circumstances, you have to be able to adjust the law to fit the circumstances. So, Vaydaber Hashem el Moshe b'midbar Sinai. The Hashem spoke to Moses in the wilderness of Sinai, Bashana Hashenit, in the second year, L'tzeitam me'eretz Mitzrayim, from their departure from Egypt, B'chodesh Harishon, in the first month, Lemor, stating, okay, saying. So all that by way of introduction. So Rashi says B'chodesh Harishon, that here it's saying that God spoke to Moses in the first month. Parsha Sheberosh HaSefer. Now, if you go and look at the very first chapter of the book of Numbers, Lo Nemra Ad Iyar, that passage is mentioned in the month of Iyar, the second month. And this passage here refers to the first month, the month of Nisan, because that's certainly when they were going to be observing Pesach. It's in the month of Nisan. So what happens is the passage that deals in the beginning of the book of Numbers is actually talking about a time that was later than the time mentioned here. So let's see. Right. Lamadata. So from this you can deduce, and he gives you Psachim, Pei Kuf, Perek. I imagine this is interesting. There are not 100 chapters in Psachim. So exactly what it could be Perek Kama, could be the first chapter, could be, and also in the Sifrei. She'ein seder mukdam umuchar b'Torah, that the statements in the Torah are not necessarily in order of appearance. In other words, literally it means there is no earlier and later in the Torah. V'lama lo patach bezo, and why didn't the book of Numbers start with this? What big deal would it have been had the book of Numbers started with this particular passage, this particular section that we're going to read? Mipnei shehu genutan shel Yisrael. Because the fact is that in mentioning this, there's something humiliating about it for the Jewish people. What is it? Shekol arba'im shana, because for the entire course of 40 years, Shayu Yisrael b'midbar, when the Israelites were in the wilderness, lo hikrivu ela Pesach ze bilvad. They did not bring, they only brought this particular Pesach alone. They didn't ever observe Pesach again. So mentioning this and realizing that they never did it again isn't exactly a compliment for the Jewish people. So that's why it's not at the beginning of the book, to draw more attention to it. And incidentally, we do start in BeHa'alot'cha, and I've mentioned this again, is that in the middle of this particular Torah portion, there is a passage that is separated by two upside down nuns. And that is a transitional passage, because when we come to the rest of the book, we're going to see that it basically involves tragedy regarding the Israelites. At this particular point, they're going to march straight into the land of Canaan to conquer it. But after the next Parsha, which I believe is Shlach Lecha, they are now condemned to die off in the wilderness and wander for 40 years. So, Vaya'asu v'nei Yisrael, the children of Israel should perform et HaPesach, the Pesach offering, b'mo'ado, at its appointed time. Rashi, b'mo'ado, at its appointed time. B'mo'ado, really at its appointed time, meaning the 15th, or rather the 14th in the evening of Nisan. B'mo'ado, af b'Shabbat. So when it says in its proper time, in its time, af b'Shabbat, even if it occurs on Shabbat, b'mo'ado, this word, af she betuma, even if they might be in a state of impurity, and there's some important and complicated laws regarding what happens to the Israelites if the majority of them are actually in a state of impurity. Do they still, in fact, perform the Pesach offering at its appointed time? And the answer, of course, is yes, they do. They do. But how you actually figure this out and the details regarding that is discussed in the Talmud, in Masechet Pesachim. One more verse we'll do. Okay. Ba'arba'a asar yom b'chodesh hazeh, on the 14th day of this month, bein harbayim, in the evening, ta'asu oto b'mo'ado. So we have b'mo'ado a second time. You shall perform it in its proper time. B'chol kuchotav, according to all its statutes, b'chol mishpatav, and according to its laws, ta'asu oto, you shall do it. You shall perform it. I'm going to put the arrow in here, but we will take a look at the Rashi. Give me a moment to get this worked out. Okay. And let's take a look at the Rashi. Kachol chukotav, according to all its statutes. Elu mitzvot shebegufo. These refer to commandments applying to the animal itself. The animal itself. Se, it should be a lamb. Tamim, perfect. Zachar, male. Ben shana, a yearling. So that's the first mitzvah, is that what you go and you take isn't just anything. You have to take a lamb in its first year. It does explain that lamb can also mean kid, can also mean a young goat. Kachol mishpatav, according to its laws. Elu mitzvot she'al gufo. So these are commandments that with regard to the lamb itself. Mimakom echad, from one, mimakom acher, so from a different place, literally. Kagon, for example, Shiv'at Yamim. So this has to do with other laws. And you should serve on a Pesach for 7 days. Le matzah, for matzah, ulevi'ur chametz, and for the removal of chametz. So these are other Pesach laws that aren't necessarily directly to do with the Pesach offering. So there are other manuscripts that have a little bit of a different version. So this stands for Sfarim Acherim, different books, literally. So the first thing is mitzvot shebegufo, meaning it's mitzvahs halachat that deal with the body, the Pesach itself. Se tamim, that it should be a perfect perfect lamb. Zachar, male, ben shana, and a yearling. She'al gufo, and so the next one is al gufo, regarding its body as well. So in other words, how you prepare it. Tzli eish, roasted on a fire. Rosho al kra'av, its head together with its legs. V'al kirbo, and also with its innards. So those were put in a bag. So you wouldn't actually eat the animal with its innards. But this is the way it had to be sacrificed. Shechutz l'kufo, and when we talk about outside of the lamb itself, so there we are, matzah, referring to matzah and the removal of chametz. And we'll leave it for this for now. If there are any comments or questions, I'll leave the recording on for a bit. Otherwise, we'll take it off. Any thoughts? So thank you, and I hope some people will share with me tomorrow.
I have some thoughts, but
1 second, I want to
Pretty
just.
straightforward.
It does seem that way.
Brad,